Afternoon's public accountability meeting. For those that don't know me, whether in the meeting or watching the broadcast, I'm Simon Dennis. I'm Interim Chief Executive and Monitoring Officer to the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner. Commissioner Mulligan will join us during the meeting. She's unavoidably delayed for the first few minutes. When she does, I'll hand over the chair to Julia. I understand normal conventions dictate that we don't do a round of introductions because everybody's named on the banner on Microsoft Teams. So we'll stick with that convention. And I also understand that the record of the meeting is taken as read on the basis that it was broadcast live and is available to be watched in terms of the previous meeting. So that takes us smoothly, I think, to item 3, which is questions for the public, and my colleague Caroline Blackburn will lead us through that item.
Many thanks, Simon. So yes, very grateful to everyone for their questions. We've received 7 questions for this PAM. Question 1 from Julie Hoyle. So please, would you elaborate, if you can, on what exactly is a stalking clinic? So we propose that this is actually covered in the stalking presentation that Pam's going to receive this afternoon. Question 2 from Alison Hume. We have a question which relates to the interpretation of the incident data, not also including the response times and duration of the incident intervention. So with that query, we're proposing that that is covered in the fire presentation, which we'll receive this afternoon as well. Questions 3 to 5 also from Alison Hume. So this is in relation to the performance report. So on page 3, there's a query. So there is said to be a dip in mental health related incidents this month. Is this not due to the current lockdown and in fact shows just a lack of reported incidents? Page 20, what analysis has been performed to make best use of deployment of new police officers? And page 21, why no increase in PCSOs? Was a resourcing decision made only for an increase in PCs? If so, who made this decision and why? Was this a central government decision? So we're proposing that this is included as part of the performance pack delivered by the police this afternoon. Question 6 from Gwen Swinburne. She has queried, when someone has been in prison for rape, what rules, good practices are in place to ensure that employees inform their staff? And what are the duty of care obligations? So we propose that Allan Harder, if he'd be willing to answer this question now, please.
Thank you, Caroline. And the question in relation to people who have been convicted of rape. If I could just start before the actual conviction in terms of investigations, because I think that's probably where we need to explain where some work is completed with employees and the management of the risk in relation to that. So when somebody is arrested in relation to an allegation or report of rape, the investigation completes a number of lines of inquiries, and one of which will look at what is the employment of that person who's been arrested. And are they in a position of trust? Do they have access to children or other vulnerable adults in relation to that? So there is a structured process in place across North Yorkshire, the City of York, in relation to adults who have got responsibility with children, for example, which is the LADO process. So that would mean a referral would go into LADO, the local area designated officer, which is a position within the council. And partners would discuss the information that is held about the report. What is the risks that are towards other children, the employment, and some safeguards would be put into place with that, probably aligned with some of the bail conditions that might exist as well during that investigation. That needs to be managed alongside what is the media strategy that might take place with an investigation, whether or not would release a suspect's names into the media, depending what the report is and who the person is, because obviously there is a need to make sure that that person has the right to a fair trial later on, and how we obtain that, and balancing that also against the need to try and identify any other potential victims that might have taken place, which would form part of an investigating officer's strategy in terms of potential witnesses or other victims. So it would be balanced in that way, working with the investigation and also with partners such as adults or children's social care. and the employers. The other element to it is, of course, when somebody's convicted, they go into prison. Upon their release from prison, they would be a registered sex offender. So through the multi-agency public protection arrangements and the offender managers that we have across the force who manage registered sex offenders, there would be a structured process of supervision whilst in the community, and where necessary, the appropriate disclosures are made either to future employers, people in relationships, or groups that they may have access to, and there's a recognised process for that. So that responsibility works with us. It sits with some of the other partners as well to make sure that the public, victims and potential victims are kept safe. And I hope that answers the question, Caroline.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Alan. If I can just move on to the final question received, question 7. If Simon could bring up the slide again, please. No? Okay. I'll just go to my own notes. So again from Gwen. So North Yorkshire Police's legal opinion informs them that Uber drivers working in York are breaking the law, so now have the power to remove them from the city. Can you ask the police to confirm what their position is after this and reports on news and local media? So I propose that Chief Constable Lisa Winward would be able to answer this question now, if possible, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you, Gwen, for your question. As you'll know, and lots of our other partners that are involved in taxi licensing and indeed people who work in that area of business across the city will know that this has been a subject that has been discussed in the media, on social media, and we've had correspondence about this matter from a policing perspective for several years now. The crux of the matter is that Uber taxis specifically are not licensed in the City of York. So City of York Council is the licensing authority for taxis and private hire vehicles, and Uber do not have a specific licence from the City of York Council, but of course they do have licences in adjoining counties, and therefore we do sometimes see Uber taxis within the city. Whether their presence in the city is legal or not is a fairly complicated matter. So although your question, Gwen, implies that they are illegal in the city, that's only in certain circumstances. So there are a complex and diverse number of licensing conditions, and there will be occasions when Uber drivers are in the city when they are operating legally within their licence. But you're right, there may be occasions when they are not compliant with their licensing conditions. So a piece of work is underway with our command team in York and the City of York Council as the licensing authority to explore those occasions when there may be a breach of licensing conditions and what actions can legally be taken to deal with those breaches of licensing conditions.
Thank you very much. What we'd propose, Simon, is that if there's any further queries from the answers that we've provided and following on from the presentations that'll be received this afternoon, if anybody wants to provide any further questions or need clarity, we're happy to take that separately out of the public accountability meeting.
Caroline, thank you for that, and to colleagues for their answers and for the ones that are to come as part of the presentations as well. So unless there's anything further in terms of that item, I think that takes us smoothly to Chief Fire Officer Andrew Brodie, who's going to present on defining and managing risk in the context of the Fire and Rescue Service. So Andrew, can I hand over to you, please?
Thank you very much indeed, Simon. Yes, you can. And I'm going to launch straight into a presentation. But before I do that, I'll just put a little bit of context as to what this is about. This is about the plan that every fire and rescue service, every fire and rescue authority, so in our case, the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner, has to prepare to say how they will run and operate their fire and rescue service over the coming years. It needs to have a minimum life of 3 years, and ours is our current one is coming to an end, and we are currently preparing the next model that we'll go out to consult upon. So that's what today's presentation really is about. It's the stage that we're at there, and that we are nearing the end of the risk profiling element of the work that we're doing. So I'll start sharing my screen now, if you don't mind. And that should allow me to move this and click that. So this is about how we define and manage risk. And I'm going to talk about how we do it now and how we are going to be doing it in the future, and how that will impact potentially the resource model that we use for delivering fire and rescue services across York and North Yorkshire. So a little bit of background as to where this comes from. The Fire and Rescue Services Act of 2004 gives rise to the national framework. So it gives the national framework statutory effect. And the national framework is where the government set out their expectations of fire and rescue authorities in England. And one of those expectations is that every fire and rescue authority will carry out and work to deliver an integrated risk management plan. And that integrated risk management plan should identify and analyse and assess all of the foreseeable risks that we are presented with in York and North Yorkshire, but also how we can contribute to national risks as well, and being able to aid other fire and rescue services. So that's what the integrated risk management plan asks us to do. It then goes on to ask us to set out how we will use prevention, protection and response resources to adequately manage that risk. So obviously prevention, it does what it says on the tin, really. It's how we prevent incidents, emergencies happening in the first place. So a huge amount of our effort now goes towards educating people and preventing those incidents happening in the first place. The second part of it is protection. So that's how we work with commerce and industry and their business as the body that oversees their compliance with fire safety legislation. And then, of course, the response element is the equipment, the fire engines, the fire crews, the officers, the call handling, all those aspects of responding to incidents when they happen. So we prevent them happening in the first place. Where they do happen, we put measures in and ensure measures are in to protect people. And then we respond to make sure that they are okay. And I'm going to add a fourth tool later on in the presentation, which is resilience, and I'll explain that later on. And then finally, what the integrated risk management plan should do is it should set out the outcomes that we intend to achieve through the work that we do. So it's an outcome-based plan. But in actual fact, we are going to call our new integrated risk management plan a risk and resource model, because we feel it better reflects what the document is intended to do. And if I take risk and resource model and call it RRM, the first R is risk. And this is the bit that we are doing now and that we are presenting to you today, or presenting our early findings and explaining how we go about it. So that's assessing the risk across North Yorkshire and York. It's looking at what hazards we face, the likelihood of that hazard causing an emergency, the likely severity of that emergency in terms of the amount of harm that it will cause. So those are the four elements of risk management for us: identifying the hazards, working out the likelihood of it causing an emergency, the severity of the harm of that emergency. Those four things. So that's the first R. The second R is resource. So once we've identified those hazards and what the risk of those hazards manifesting themselves in harm is, we then look at our budget, we look at our existing resources, we look at other resources that are available to fire and rescue services in the UK, and we work out how best to balance prevention, protection, response and resilience, as I'll come to. We look how best to locate our fire stations, our fire engines, the type of fire engines, the type of crewing arrangements that we operate to turn out those fire engines, and the approaches that we take to preventing, protecting, responding and creating community resilience. So that's what the risk and resource model is. So hopefully I'm going to stop referring to integrated risk management plan now and refer to risk and resource model, because that should make more sense, hopefully, to people viewing and learning about this. So the current model that we have now is the community safety plan, 2016-17 to 2021. This year it needs to be replaced. And the Commissioner's local Oakland business case for becoming the Fire and Rescue Authority identified that the current model that we use to define risk is limited. And that was very strongly backed up by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Fire and Rescue Services when they inspected us in 2019. And at the bottom of this slide, you can see that they gave us 2 out of 4. We require improvement. So this was in the pillar of that inspection of effectiveness. And they said overall we were good at being effective. But there are 5 elements to that. We were good at 3 and we required improvement on 2. One of the ones that we required improvement on was understanding the risk of fire and other emergencies. So what they found, and what the Commissioner found when developing her Oakland business case, was that our model that we still work with for now is based on the historical number and type of incidents we've attended over a 5-year period. So what we do is we look at the type of incidents that different stations have attended and we score them. So a road traffic collision is worth 5 points, a building fire 5 points, because they're the most serious incidents that we attend. So when I talk about severity, they're the most severe. Outdoor fires score 2, and an automatic false alarm scores 0.1, because they are less severe normally than the road traffic collision and the building fire. And what we did was we worked out how many of each of those incidents each of those stations had been to. We multiplied it by the scoring factor, and that gave us a total score for the station. So you can see, if you look really closely, I can tell you that the station area with the highest risk is York, and the station area with the lowest risk is up in Danby in the Moors. And it was primarily that data that determined the resource model for the next 5 years, where we were going to put our fire engines and our fire stations. Of course, larger, they're brick buildings, so they stay where they are. But we looked at, were they in the right place? Did they have the right number of fire engines? Did they have the right type of equipment? And did they have the right crewing arrangement to mobilise and to keep them available? And that's what we've been working with, but that is what we've been criticised for as being too basic an approach to measuring risk. It's based on historical data as opposed to future predictions of where the risk is. And there was other bits of data used around some data from partner agencies, such as the police crime data and commercially available data, but it wasn't really a driving set of our data that we based the real decisions on about resourcing. They were based upon historical data. The advice from Her Majesty's Inspectorate and my own advice coming into the service is that we should use a far more nuanced set of data to determine how we run our service. And that's what we are doing at the moment. So we are creating a new risk profile, and these are some of the data sets that we're using. These are the main ones, and I've categorized them so it makes it straightforward to understand. People data, that's where the pockets of population are or aren't. Gender and age, all factors that can affect somebody's likelihood of suffering an incident. And what's really important to recognize here is that the thing that we are interested in as being at risk is the person, not the building or not the road network or not the anything else. It's the risk to people that we are interested in here. So we are interested in identifying where those people are who we know are most likely to suffer a severe incident. So we look at societal data because there's lots of causes of people being more vulnerable. So we look at the indices of multiple deprivation because we know people from deprived areas, communities, estates and places are more likely to suffer an incident. We look at social housing and the type of tenure, the type of rent tenure that people have got. Because again, we know that there are certain types of housing and certain types of tenure which place people, well, they don't place people in themselves at greater risk, but the people who live in those places can be at a different risk because, of course, it's people largely who cause our demand. We look at health, people who live alone, smoking and alcohol and drug misuse, mental health problems, all things that create the likelihood of somebody suffering an incident. So we look at that. So look at people and society. But we also do look at infrastructure because the infrastructure will determine in future, it's a good predictor of what might happen in future rather than always looking back. So we're looking at local plans that the district councils have got for building, for housing, for non-residential building risk, factories, shops, offices, hotels, all those types of places, and the transport network. So a lot of our incidents, most severe incidents, are road traffic collisions. So we look at changes to the transport network and how they might affect the number of incidents that we're likely to attend. The upgrade of the A1M has reduced the number of overall incidents and the severity of those incidents as a result. So we need to consider that in determining future resources. We're going to have HS2, high-speed 2 rail, coming through our area. That's a future risk that we need to consider how we resource up for it, both during the construction and once it's operating. Environmental data. So I said earlier on, largely it's people who cause our incidents, who cause our demand, but of course, weather causes our demand as well. If we get a very wet spell, a very wet winter, the flood risk increases. If we get a very dry summer or a very dry winter, the wildfire risk increases. And we need to consider what might happen, not just what has happened in the past. And then we look to other data sets around the National Risk Register and our local risk register for York and North Yorkshire to see, okay, what other types of hazard are being identified in these places. We need to consider that when we're determining how we operate our fire and rescue service. So that's some of the new data sets that we're going to be using, but I do want you to realise that we are also using 5 years of incident data because it is helpful. It is a useful barometer for what might happen in the future. But rather than that being our only barometer for what might happen in the future, we are also considering all of these other factors that can affect the likelihood of an incident and the severity of it. And I'm going to pause at this point. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, if I can work out how to do that. And I am going to bring in Jonathan Dyson and Dave Winspea. Am I back? Right, I'm back. So I'm going to bring in Jonathan Dyson and Dave Winspea to talk a bit more about that data, because what they'll be able to expand upon is some of the data sets that we haven't used because they weren't appropriate or because we couldn't access them. And what they'll also be able to do is answer the question that has been asked from a member of the public, because they've got that greater level of detail, I suppose. I set the strategic direction for this. Jonathan and Dave are part of the team who are putting together the detailed work. So over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. What I'll do is I'll let David run through the data sets that we've actually utilised, and then I'll answer the question from the public. Thank you, Dave.
So, as the Chief has said, one of the big significant changes to our approach from years gone by is about understanding what risk really means in North Yorkshire, City of York. And we have a number of definitions in our approach to this, but the one that's really important to understand is what's called relative risk. And we've also broken it down into a number of category areas. So we're really going to be focused in our risk resource model on fire, road-related risk, and environmental risk, in particular flooding. So they're the three kind of primary areas that we want to understand what, where, why, how, who, etc. are affected by those things. And in putting the risk resource model together and generating the community risk profile, our research and our understanding, our professional understanding from what we know from old has been really significant. So when we look at profiling fire-related risk, we know that there are certain factors, certain attributes that put people more likely to have a fire in the home than others. And we also know that there are factors that put people more likely to have a fire that can lead to serious injury or, unfortunately, a fatality than others. And it's by understanding that we'll be able to then choose or identify appropriate data sets that we can then build into a modelling tool which we've used to profile the county and give us a view of relative risk across the North Yorkshire Fire Service area. So public, they predominantly come from very trustworthy sources, in particular the Office of National Statistics. And that's really important for us because this model has to be able to withstand scrutiny. It's got to be based on valid and reliable, sustainable data. We've also used some of our, what we might call closed source data, which is our own data that we've got within, and the Chief has talked a little bit about our own incident data, which we've used to validate some of our profiling. And we've also been able to access data sets from partner agencies where they've been able to share that with us in a profile that we've built is down to what is called a lower super output area. In other words, it's down to a geographical area that holds within it approximately 1,200 individuals. And of course, if you take a look at the county of North Yorkshire, there are some very densely populated areas. So naturally, those LSOAs are much smaller in size. And there are some very sparsely populated areas in the county. So again, by the same token, there are some very or much larger geographical areas, but they basically mean the same thing. They capture that amount of people. And we've used the same data sets to profile and then use a grading system to give us where we think there is a higher level of risk tracking down through to a lower level of risk. And that's relative risk. And it's relative risk within North Yorkshire Fire Service area. So if you take one of these LSOAs and compare that to maybe another part of the country, it might prove to be a higher or lower level in comparison to their area as well. So it's very much to understand this is about North Yorkshire City using those data sets. Just moving quickly on to the other two areas around environmental, in particular flooding. For that, we've used environmental data from the Environment Agency, in particular looking at the flood layers and where we know we can expect to see flooding, particularly sort of river-led flooding, and the floodplains that are affected by that. And with road-related incidents, we've used historic incident data that comes from basically the Road Safety Partnership. So this is information that covers all road-related serious injuries and fatalities, not just a larger number of incidents that take place than those that we attend. So it's important for us to understand the real wide picture of risk on the roads. And that takes us and tracks us back to what the Chief was talking about when it looks at our prevention and our resilience options within our service delivery, because this is not just about a response model. This is about how we provide the full suite of our service to the community, which is prevention, protection, response, and as the Chief said, resilience, which is about trying to help make communities more stronger and supporting them in doing that. Jonathan, I don't know if you want to add anything further at this point.
Thank you, Dave. What I'll do now is, and thank you for explaining the interventions for prevention and protection. What I think is very important for the public to understand that this for us is a fundamental step forward. We are now, with the new risk models, actively engaged and dynamically able to understand where risk is and then start to tailor our service towards there, tailor our response, not just from fire engines, but also from our staff and the activities that we do to lower their risk. So onto the public question, looking at it from two perspectives. The first one, looking at response time. Now, we do look at response times across the county, but we also break that down into individual station areas. And we do this because that gives us a much richer picture and understanding how quickly each appliance is able to turn out from the station over to the risk area, but also on the duty systems that we use, because on-call firefighters have a delayed turnout due to the time that it takes them to drive from home to the station and then mobilise from there. So these produce individual timed footprints for each station. And that footprint allows us to capture a lot of rich information relating to the number of households and types of properties that were in there, which, as Andrew discussed, it's around the density and then the people risk within those areas. It allows us to look at the number of incidents that we've attended in that area, i.e. for prevention and protection, are there specific targeted responses we need to put into there? And most importantly, it allows us to look at the life risk, i.e. do we get a significant number of life risk house fires, a significant number of road incidents or flooding or environmental incidents. And again, that allows us to tailor our response through prevention, protection and resilience for communities directly into that area. So it's a very focused approach, but it still has county-wide outcomes of the safety of the entire county, because of course this includes people driving through and coming into working in the area. And of course, within summer times, it includes those that are coming to the county to enjoy the coastline. What the isochrones, which is the footprint, also allows us to do is performance manage internally. Now we have to report statistics through to the Home Office and to the Her Majesty's Inspector of Fire and Rescue Services about our response time performance. Now we can benchmark ourselves against other services locally and nationally, but internally it allows us to understand, are there things we need to change or try to improve to decrease the time that it takes us to turn out from the station? Because the drive time is pretty much a fixed area, depending on, as the Chief said, changes to a road network, which may increase or decrease how fast we get there. So we look at how quickly our control staff are able to call handle, i.e. take the call, decide on the resources needing to go out, and then release the appliances. And then we look at how quickly crews are able to turn out. And that is can be a very in-depth thing, because we look at how close the people are to the appliances. That focuses on new building designs. It's everything. So we build this in as the prevention and protection, and then the response element is the final part we look at. Another question related to incident intervention, and this is again a very fundamental point for us, so thank you for the question. We do look at this. We look at a number of points on how many appliances attend incidents. We look at where those are, so we can tell then if there are significant points, again, that are forming a risk which requires a large intervention, such as industry or industrial sites. And then we look at how long those appliances are in attendance. Now, that's important to us because if we have a large number of big incidents, say 5 or 6 appliances, and they are keeping appliances tied up for a long time, that reduces fire cover across the county. So our control staff then need to make fire cover moves, we call it, which is where we move appliances or resources around the county to continue to provide cover to the largest areas or the largest risk. And this is part of that new continual mapping design, which will allow us to tailor the service for prevention and protection, resilience, and of course then the response element that we're putting in place. Thank you.
What I'm just going to do, Jonathan and Andrew, is just bring up a couple of slides now, which are some of the profile maps that we've got.
Okay.
Just bear with me 1 second. I'll try and pull them quickly for you.
And while Dave's doing that, I'll just quickly mention about response times. Response times are important, but what we are reluctant to do is to have target response times, because we fear that they will drive behaviours that aren't as helpful as we would like. It's in the very DNA of the Fire and Rescue Service to respond very quickly to incidents, as quickly as possible. There's nobody putting in any delay. So the time we take is the time we take. But what we do want to have is a set of principles that make sure that that time is as short as possible, and that the quality of the driving, the quality of the call handling is appropriate. So we will set those principles and we will measure everybody's ability to meet them, and we will measure the response times because it will give us important data to know where we need to improve. So it's not that we don't measure them, we do, but what we're reluctant to do is to set target response times because we fear that it will drive people to behave in such a way that everything's done with great haste, but perhaps not the correct speed. But what absolutely we can assure everybody is that there is nobody doing anything to delay in any shape, way or form the response that we make or the quality of the response that we make. But sorry, Dave, over to you. I just filled the gap while you were getting the slides up.
Thank you. Are they showing, by the way, somewhere? I can't.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes,
Dave, you are.
Thank you. Yeah. So this is an example of one of the profiles. This is looking at fire-related risk profile. So the way I've described it to date is we've taken a number of factors or things that in an equation, they start to add up or they multiply and they create a score. The score itself has then been banded to give the idea of a relative risk, and we've used a sort of an embellished RAG system, if you like, to show that. So this map here is really showing the county itself with the City of York. It's broken down. The red lines or the black lines are what we call the LSOAs, the lower super output areas. And you'll see if you look at Harrogate, for example, or York or Scarborough, you've got a lot of LSOAs in a very small geographical area. Whereas if you go up on towards the North Yorkshire moors, you'll see that they are. You can't probably see it very easily. The picture on the right is trying to show you in Scarborough, for example, that you do have a range of risk within the Scarborough area. So again, you're going from certain parts of the town which have got more significant density of people meeting those factors that we've identified, right through to areas where it's less dense, that it's not as high a score. And this is really important for us to understand so that we can target our resources most appropriately to try to reduce and mitigate risk and support individuals. And if we look at other types of our work, businesses and people coming into the county for whatever reason they need to be there for. So that's what this map shows us, and it helps us there know about, or helps us with our decision making when we come to look at how to resource our service to meet the community needs. So it's a map that that's got information behind it. We've tried to display it in a way that's easy for a member of the public or a partner. We can explain and we can go into more detail if that is required about what's behind all of this. But more importantly, it helps with decision making for us going forward as well, which is what Andrew was talking about at the very outset. If I just move down to another map. Now this one is obviously looking at road incidents. This actually shows where we've used our own data to plot historic incidents that we've gone to. In our modelling, there are other maps that we've put in, as I said a few moments ago, where we've taken the much wider range of incidents we go to or take place in the North Yorkshire, City of York area. And that's important because whilst this is showing you what we go to, and the dots and the colours, they illustrate, is it a road traffic collision involving a light vehicle, as in a car, through to heavy goods vehicles? Is it something where we've gone and not had to do anything, or is it where there's been scene safety? Or is it where there's been multiple vehicles involved? Okay, and we have more data in the background we can look at. So we can look at where there's a serious injury, where it's maybe a fatal accident, for example, and obviously we can look at linking that with other partners' information and data as well going forward to say, is there a particular issue starting to emerge that we want to focus on with maybe our prevention services? So it's just an illustration where we've used our own data set to show where we've attended incidents, but we can then compare that to where there are things happening that we don't go to. A good, quite a high number do take place involving pedestrians and cyclists in York, but as a fire service we don't tend to get mobilised to a lot of those. but it is something that we can try to focus on our prevention work, particularly around working in the schools, for example. So that's just to illustrate a point.
Shall I take back over now, Dave?
Please do. Yeah.
Andrew, just before you resume, I'm just conscious that our colleague Fiona had a question in relation, I think, to data. I don't know what it was specifically, but it might just be timely to take that question from Fiona now before you launch back into the remainder of the presentation. So, sure. Fiona, can I come to you?
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions. You showed the societal, the people relative risk map, which is really interesting. And I know that that's been determined by several factors that lead to an increased likelihood of a house fire. And those factors have probably been determined nationally from national data. I just wondered whether your local data supports the fact that those are the four factors that do increase likelihood of a dwelling fire in North Yorkshire and the City of York. Second question, that was about relative people risk. What about building risk? And my third one was you have a really rich picture now of risk across the county. The lifespan of your risk and resource model is, as a document, will be upwards of 3 years. How often will you review your risk profile to make sure that your resource model is current and in line with changing risk? Sorry, that's quite a few questions.
Do you want to start, Jonathan?
Dave's taking question one.
Okay.
Yes, very much based on our understanding, the issues that lead or put people.
Dave, we are getting some periodic problems. I don't know whether everybody else's experience is the same with your audio feed. It might be helped if you switch the camera off and start the answer again.
Sure. Okay. Yes, Fiona, is the answer. We do have a good understanding of the factors that put people at risk of having a fire in a domestic setting, and also going beyond that, the factors that put people more at risk of having a fire that leads to serious injury. We have a dedicated fire investigation team in North Yorkshire Fire Service who are specialised in looking into what's led to the cause of a fire, and that does take into account, as we said throughout this presentation, the factors, the lifestyle, the people factors that are pertinent to each individual case. That information is something that we share regionally. We work with our regional colleagues in the Yorkshire area, and we've done in the past a piece of academic research looking into the question you've raised, which has kind of borne out and paid testament to what we thought we knew. It's kind of just basically consolidated that. And of course, we've gone wider than that, and we've looked at national research. So the information that comes from the Home Office, and in particular the safety in English homes, is really important, because that equally aligns to what we already knew. So we've looked at a number of very credible sources to corroborate our understanding, and we've used that very much as the basis to build the community risk profile. I don't know if somebody else wants to come in now on another part.
So I'm going to come in quickly, Jonathan. Just sorry, because it's said sometimes in fire and rescue service when they're talking about equality, diversity, and inclusion work that fire doesn't discriminate. Neither do we. And I take a bit of exception to that, to be honest with you, because fire does discriminate. It affects some members of our communities more than others, and there are factors that affect that. So we make sure we've got a limited amount of resource. So it's really important that we use it to the absolute best effect that we can. So we target our resource at those households and those neighbourhoods where we know there is an increased likelihood of a house fire, for example. And we will do our prevention and protection work specifically in those people's houses, because we know that's the way that we will have the greatest impact on reducing risk, the likelihood and severity of harm in York and North Yorkshire. So these maps really help us across our whole area determine where to put our resources, but further they then help the local crews to target their resource in the places, their effort in the places they know that they will have the greatest effect. And I'll just pause at that point, just put it in a really kind of plain language that I can understand, just to try and put all of that in context for how it affects the way we do our jobs.
Okay, thank you. Right, I'll answer the third part of your question, Fiona, around how often do we review the risk profile. The new model and our new method of working will allow us to have varying performance levels. So on a very individual and station level, we'll be able to review what activities the fire crews are working on, and if there is a positive or negative effect of what they're actually working on to reduce risk and vulnerability in the community on a monthly basis. And this will help us on 2 points. One is so that we will understand, are we targeting in the right way? And two, if we need to increase or decrease resources as appropriate for that. And of course, we'll be able to understand that from the incident data and also from the risk profiles, because then we'll understand what the performances the chief talks about of the community, the number of fires, the risk and the vulnerability within there that we're having a positive impact upon. We also will review everything we're doing after we have for instance, a targeted intervention. So in line with the National Fire Chiefs Council, we've had Electrical Safety Week. When we've done intervention and we've done promotion of safety messages, it's important for us then to evaluate and see if that has changed any of the risk or if there's further work that we need to do. And then we're able to share that across the county into individual stations. And of course, if it's necessary, we'll share it nationally with others, which then allows us the opportunity to continually learn and evaluate what we're doing. And then annually, there will be an annual statement of assurance against what work we've done, the impact it's had, and what changes we've actually made, i.e. good or bad, the shared learning and the direction that we're taking. And that feeds into the frameworks that we have to provide nationally to the HMI, the Inspectorate, and also to Andrew and to Julia as the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner. Thank you.
So,
Thank
Andrew,
you.
I think we're back with you, aren't we? I'm just conscious of time and the fact that members of the public who are watching the broadcast would I think hope to tune in roughly on time for the various items.
Yep.
So we're entirely in your hands, your discretion, Andrew. So on you go.
I'm on the last slide, and I've decided not to actually put it because, well, hopefully it's nicer to look at humans than it is to look at boring words on a page. So the last slide is about what next. What do we do with all of this rich information that we're gathering about risk in our communities? Well, the next steps are to interpret all of that data so we really fully understand risk in York and North Yorkshire. We get right underneath it and we know where it is. We know how to discriminate in terms of offering our resources to people. And we will review the way that we balance prevention, protection, response and resilience activity to deal with those risks. So people tend to look at the fire brigade and focus very, very heavily on the response. And, oh, if there's risk, we must put fire engines and firefighters in there. But not necessarily. Of course, you look at somewhere like Scarborough, built up, highly populous, with pockets of risk. Clearly, they will response is an important part of that. That's why we've got full-time firefighters who can respond instantly from the fire station in the town. But it also allows us to target our prevention and our protection and our resilience work, both in those very urban areas, but also in the more rural areas as well. And I talk a lot. I've set out an expectation of local crews and local managers that they own the safety of their local community and they use the tools of prevention, protection, response and resilience to keep their community safe. And we will do that. So the next step will be to say, right, this is where we're going to place our assets, our buildings, our fire engines, our people, our equipment. But also this is where we're going to target that prevention and protection and resilience work. And people will do that at a global scale across our whole area, but also local firefighters, local community safety officers and fire protection officers will do the same. Now, I want to touch a little bit on the resilience aspect, because the legislation only requires us to do prevention, protection and response. But I look at a place like North Yorkshire, very rural, long travel distances for our fire engines. At the moment, it's not always possible to keep all of our fire engines available because we just don't get the numbers of people coming forward wanting to be firefighters, on-call firefighters in those rural areas. So I think it's important that we help the public to help themselves. So when I talk about resilience, I'm talking about helping the public to prepare for an incident when it happens. That might be targeted around flooding in Reeth or Leyburn. It might be targeted around wildfire in other areas, but helping the public to help themselves before the incident occurs. Then helping them to help themselves at the time of the incident, before we arrive. And then finally, helping the public to help themselves to recover from the incident as quickly as possible. And I'll give a quick example of this, and it's York, and it's around water rescue, because York is our main centre in North Yorkshire and York, where we respond to water rescues. And the crews are already doing it. And I'll just describe it very quickly. They prevent it through education. They educate people. They go to Freshers Week events to teach people about the dangers of falling into the river. They protect by working with a local authority to make sure that there are throw lines, life belts, fencing to stop people falling in or to give them some protection when they do. They're able to respond brilliantly. They've got the right equipment, the right skills, training, attitude and everything to get there and to recover somebody who has managed to fall in. But they're also creating resilience. So, for example, they're working with licensing authorities, licensees, to teach door staff and pub staff, for example, because unfortunately a lot of people who fall in have had a drink, to teach them what to do prior to our arrival and to teach them what to do in a safe manner before we get there. So there's a beautiful example of all four of those tools being used. And I could give myriad examples, but I'm not going to because of time. But that's what this is all about. Identifying where the risk is across our whole area and locally, making sure that our resources are spread properly around our whole area, and also that those local crews, firefighters, community safety officers and fire protection officers can target their local effort to have the greatest effect. That's where we're at the moment, but we still got to do that bit. We've done the risk profiling bit now. We now need to analyse that and then decide the resource bit. And we will go out to formal consultation on the resourcing bit. So timeline-wise, where we're at, March and April, we will be interpreting that risk and developing the options for where we place our resources, or where we ask the public and say, this is what we think based on our own professional knowledge and all of this analysis and working out that we've done. So we'll be doing that in March and April and coming up with options. We will then draft those options up and present them in May. Across the summer for 90 days, the Fire and Rescue Authority, so the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner, will lead that consultation, that public consultation, to find out what they think about the options that we've presented and which are their preferred options. And then come autumn and winter, once we've got all of the findings from that consultation, we will put together, on behalf of the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner, the final risk and resource model to begin to implement over the next period of 4 years for the tenure of that Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner. But that gets back to what Jonathan was saying. It doesn't suddenly become a fixed model that we can never adapt, even if we know that the risk is changing. It can always be adapted, but it will always be adapted in such a way that it makes us better able to manage the risk in our area. And Simon, I will pause at that point. Hopefully I've given confidence that where we are now is at the risk profiling stage, much more nuanced, much more detailed data that we're using to give us a much more rich and accurate picture or prediction of what we will be dealing with in future. And also that we will be now going away and applying all of our knowledge and modelling tools to come up with the best model to actually resource to manage that risk.
Andrew, thank you, and thanks colleagues who've also presented on that topic. And Andrew, as you rightly say, there is a very lengthy period of consultation involved in every cycle of this process, and that will be a very important responsibility for the incoming commissioner to lead on that consultation. Are you able to say where members of the public can find out more in the meantime from the service? And just perhaps a little bit about the development of the model and how they can contribute their views if they wish to do so.
Yes, I can. So there will be lots of information on our website. There will be information on the Office of the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner website as well. We will publicly launch the consultation when that point comes in the summer, and we will direct people to where they can go and make that response. But what we're also developing is a plan for how we can engage directly with politicians and with members of the public, where they can come and directly ask us questions and give their views on risk as well. Because of course we use our own knowledge, we use data, but there are 820,000 people or something in York and North Yorkshire, all of whom have got some knowledge about risk and some view about risk. So we're really relying on people helping us as well to identify anything that we might not have done, or to give their view on our opinion of risk, and to help them understand, learn why it is that we say it is as it is, but give them the opportunity to challenge us on that as well. So there's that 90-day consultation is very real, it's very genuine. We don't go into that thinking, well, we think this is best and therefore that's what you will get. We go into that saying, we think this is best on all of the data that we've analysed, on all of our professional opinion, on all of our historical incident data, but what do you think? And we will listen to that very, very much. And at the end of that 90 days, there will then be a further process to assess all of that other information that we've got from humans and put that into the final model that we create.
Andrew, thank you. Thanks for that. Just before we move on from this topic then, are there any questions from colleagues in the virtual room? I'll take it that there perhaps aren't, in which case item 5 is North Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service performance update. Am I with you, Andrew, for that, or directly with John Foster? John Foster, I can see on screen.
John, yeah.
Hi, Simon. Thank you, and thanks, and good afternoon, everyone. I shall just share with you a presentation, if I can do, please. Again, I can't see the screen now, so can everybody see that?
Yes.
Is that?
Yes.
Thank you. That's all I needed. Okay, so this is a performance summary for January 2021, and we shall just go through the incident overview to start with. So really, the incidents that we achieved in which we responded to in January of this year was slightly more than we had in December, but not quite as many as we had in November. When I look at the trend over the 3-month period there, the area that was the increase was special service calls. And what this means is it's where we've got adverse weather events. So if we look over onto the top 10 incidents on the right-hand column here, you'll notice that the flooding incidents at line 3 there, and also at line 6 were where we achieved the increase. So compared to the same quarter last year, flooding in the open, we responded to 24 events in that period, compared to 5 the year previously, and 60 flooding in premises, compared to 27 in the same period last year. If you remember, we had Storm Christoph, which hit in January, and the results of that meant that our incidents profile in that area were increased. We responded well to those incidents, and particularly in the Malton area, we had our high volume pumps in action down there for quite a number of days to assist the local community down there. False alarm overview, it shows there that in the November, December and January periods, the response to false alarms has actually fallen. And again, that's largely due really to the lockdown which we've experienced over those months. And of course, in January, we've gone into full lockdown, and that's reflective in those numbers there I would expect that they will rise, but it's a real area of focus that we are looking at now. And just to drill into that a little bit further, our false alarm overview really, false alarms fall into a number of different categories. So false alarm malicious could be where someone breaks a brake glass or dials 999 maliciously, and they're fortunately a low proportion of the false alarms which we attend. The next area there is false alarm good intent, which is the orange there, 20%. They are where people may see flames, but actually once we've responded, it turns out to be controlled burning or something that isn't actually an incident. So that's false alarm good intent. And then finally there, false alarm automatic fire detection systems. They are the automatic fire alarms that operate. And so a range of different categories that false alarms lead into. Now, if I go on to the next slide, this shows how those false alarms in terms of the detection systems are broken down. So the top slide there shows...
Sorry to interrupt. Are you happy to take questions as we go along?
Yes, I am. And sorry, I can't see hands. So if there is anybody who's got any questions, please feel free to ask.
I'll try to choreograph the questions without interrupting the flow too much. But the question comes from Fiona. So
it's just one quick one, John. And like you said, the malicious false alarms account for a small proportion of the total, but I was just wondering what as a service, what your response to sort of dealing with those is.
Okay, so there's a number of ways which we would deal with these. So, for example, if it was a break glass point that's been put through, at a premises, we will work with the local responsible person there to try and understand what's happened, why it's happened, and who may be responsible. Obviously, difficult to predict, but of course, it all depends on the premises which we're responding to. So, if it's a hotel, it could be someone who's perhaps had a little too much to drink, or it could be children in schools. It could be a range of different scenarios, but we will always work with the responsible person for the premises to have a look at that. Now, if it's a 999 call made by a telephone into control room, generally we operate on what we call a 3-strike basis there. So if that's a one call that comes in, depending on the situation, we'll try and we always return the call. So if someone rings up, asks something, as in a response to an incident, and when we get there we can't find it, we'll back up that call, we'll return the call to them. But of course, if it's a hoax, it won't be answered. If that happens 3 times from the same number, that is where we have got the ability. Then we work with our police colleagues. We work with if it's a mobile phone, work with mobile phone providers where we have access in to be able to get that phone decommissioned, if you like, so that they're no longer able to use that phone. So once we get to three calls from the same number, and that doesn't need to be on the same day, that could be over a period of time. We monitor, we log it, and we hold that information on our system. And we also share that information. So if we get to that point of 3, then we would check with police colleagues, possibly ambulance colleagues, to see if they've had similar calls from that same telephone. So there's a number of ways which we deal with the hoax calls there. Fortunately, as I say, they are low numbers, but nonetheless, each one of those is a disruptive call which we don't need, and we will deal with them. I hope that answers your question, Fiona.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so just looking at the detail of our automatic fire detection systems. So this graph at the top here shows the separation, if you like. So we respond generally to automatic fire alarms either within domestic dwellings where people are living or non-residential. So the non-residential are the business premises, and the residentials could be hotels, care homes, hospitals, or indeed just private homes. The majority of those styles of call come from where we've got people living and residing. And of course, wherever we have people residing, that is what we class as a life risk. So we take those calls very, very seriously. The bottom left-hand graph shows the spread of calls in terms of the residential. So generally in the residential area, the calls that we respond to there are what we call, again, false alarm, good intent. So this could be where the system has actually operated properly, and it could be because of cooking fumes, burnt toast, or other things that have happened within that premise that have actually activated the alarm properly, and it's worked as it should do. But the cause of that has been through good intent reasons. And then the other 42% are where faults on the system occur. With any style of technology, there are the faults. These systems are very, very sensitive. So now and again, there are faults on the systems, unfortunately. And then on the right-hand column, that graph there shows the same spread, but within the commercial environment, so non-residential. And again, there, what it shows there is a reverse, really. So the majority of calls at commercial premises tend to be more faults on systems as opposed to being activated by the system operating as it should do, but by other means being activated. So what we will do on both of those is work with the building occupiers, work with the residents to try and identify solutions. So if it is burnt toast, for example, we can look towards education there. We can look towards making sure that the detector heads are the correct style, in the correct place, etc. And so we'll always work closely with the resident and the building occupiers to try and come up with the best solution we can do. At the moment, we don't have the universities open, but York University, as we get new influx of students there, there's generally a spike, but we combat that with working closely with the premises responsible people, and also necessarily giving training and advice to these students there. Okay, moving on to the next slide. This is just looking at our overall availability levels of fire cover over the period of January. I'm pleased to say 91% availability of all our fire appliances throughout January. And again, this is really quite reflective of the COVID lockdown, where people have actually been working from home, and that has a positive impact on our overall on-call availability levels. And that's reflected more so on this slide here. So January, 90% of our on-call fire appliances were available, compared to 84% in December. And again, that's largely down to the fact that we had people furloughed or perhaps working from home, which then adds the availability to fire and rescue service. The on-call duty system is not, that relies on people travelling in from either the workplace or the home on response for call. We have a project ongoing at the moment, which is looking very closely at how we will improve overall availability levels of the on-call service. This slide here now looks at our community safety overview. And again, reflective of the COVID lockdown restrictions, our ability to go into people's homes and do safe and well has been restricted because of vulnerability out there to COVID. So our safe and well activities, which is the grey line there, have fallen slightly through December and January, and again that is due to the restrictions. I mean, it's still a high priority areas to go out and focus on the vulnerable, but our ability and capability to access people's homes has been curtailed somewhat. However, what crews have been doing is involved in making telephone calls to shielded people to ensure that they're okay, and we've been working very closely with North Yorkshire County Council to support them in that. So there's an increase in that style of work, which is directly COVID related as a result of that. Moving on to the business safety overview, there are a number of areas there which we get involved with. Pleased to say that we're now starting to see increases across the board on our activity levels with business safety. And again, this is being sort of suppressed, shall we say, over the past 12 months now due to COVID, and a lot of business premises now operating in a very different way than they were pre-COVID. But now we're working closely again with businesses as they begin to open up Our regulator activity there in January 21, you can see has vastly improved, which is really pleasing to see. And this is where crews are actively engaged in undertaking audits, be it either on premises or by doing them what we call desk-based audits, but nonetheless that's improving and increasing all the way. And as we come out of lockdown, now that we've got plans in place, there'll be further increases across the board on that coming forward. And finally, just to look at our absence slide. So this slide here shows absence of staff throughout the last 12 months of beginning April. The grey line there shows where we've had confirmed cases of COVID, and you can see there from December onwards, throughout the whole pandemic, from December onwards, that's when we've really been hit worse. But I'm pleased to say, even though it looks higher on that graph, they're still very, very low numbers, and that hasn't affected our impact to respond in any way. Wherever we have had instances where we've had to self-isolate a whole crew because of the close proximity working arrangements, we've always been able to support that by other means to make sure that overall appliance availability is maintained. And so I'll stop sharing there and see if there's any questions. There we go.
So, John, nothing particularly from me. I'll throw the item open for discussion. Andrew, was there anything that you wanted to add?
No, Simon, I think John's covered everything. Clearly, we remain in odd times, but as the Prime Minister's announcement yesterday kind of demonstrates, society is going to reopen, business is going to reopen, and tourism is going to reopen, and that is going to have an effect on risk for ourselves and, of course, for Lisa and all of her policing colleagues. So we've got to be very acutely aware of the rapid changes that are going to be coming over the next few months and make sure that we can adapt very quickly to that changing circumstance, if you like. So the data is really interesting. I think the really extra interesting thing will be what happens with it over the coming months as everything starts to return to a degree of normality.
Yes, thank you. And I'm sure Julia would make this point if she was here. And as you've made it, Andrew, and it links to that last slide, is just to acknowledge, as we begin to move into another phase of lockdown, the pressures that this has brought for our colleagues in the respective services and across our partner organisations, and just to pay that continuing tribute on Julia's behalf, and I'm sure on everybody in the meeting's behalf as well.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Chief Constable, are there any opening remarks you would like to make before we move on to the policing themed items?
No, thank you, Simon, and thank you for the presentation we've just seen, because it is very relevant in terms of the risk and partnership working that we all try and deal with together, and we often encounter the same members or areas of our communities, and actually if we can work closely together on some of those risks, then it's back to the prevention agenda. So that's really helpful. So moving forward then in terms of prevention of other natures, Allan, who is our Detective Superintendent in charge of safeguarding, is going to provide a presentation on stalking and harassment, a very topical issue, very closely linked to some of the most vulnerable people in our society that we deal with, but are not necessarily deemed to be vulnerable. And these are sometimes individuals who, wouldn't ordinarily be seen as vulnerable individuals, but by absolute way of the fact that stalking and harassment can be a very difficult and psychological issue, and not just some of the traditional vulnerabilities that people might see. A really important subject, and I would urge people watching, absolutely these are issues we want to tackle and are sometimes very hidden in our society. So on that point, I will hand over to Allan. Thank you.
Ma'am, thank you very much in relation to that. I hope that the presentation is now displayed on the screen. and then it's come up and that's visible. Can I just check, because when that does come up, I can't see it from my side. Is that shown?
Yeah, Alan, yes, it is.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, so we've been asked to come today, Simon, to provide the Police and Crime Commissioner the assurance in terms of the force's response in relation to stalking, which we'd like to do through this presentation as we go through it. So just to try and put some of the comments that the Chief Constable has made around the seriousness of stalking into some of the context on a national level, I think would be helpful. And so for that reason, I'll just move to the next slide. And because stalking in itself presents some national challenges in relation to how policing respond to those. So it's the same in North Yorkshire and many other forces across the country. When we start to look at some of the key statistics that stalking has, there are really clear links between stalking, domestic abuse, how women are often more likely to be the victims than males, and that in itself can present a reporting issue, of the gap for some men to come forward and report the fact that they may be victims in relation to it. So when you start to look at the number of people that have experienced stalking over the last 12 months in the UK, 2.3 million is a lot of people, okay, when we start to think about that. Also, these are incidents that just don't take place once, such as a burglary. These are incidents in terms of stalking that continue, and what we would call within the police, along with our people in CPS, is a course of conduct. It's more than one, and it's a continuation of incidents that take place against a victim. And many victims, when they've been victims of stalking, have suffered over 100 incidents before even reporting it to the police. So that continuous concern, that continuous fear that victims of stalking have is present in every day. And that's why some people refer to stalking as murder in slow motion, because of that slow, continuous impact that it's having on people's lives. And I think one of the important facts to also remember is that of females that have been murdered, in 94% of cases, they have been stalked beforehand. So the escalation from a stalking incident to homicide is a very clear and recognisable link. And that's why we need to make sure that we get the responses to stalking correctly, that we can identify perpetrators correctly, and most importantly, be able to support victims to make sure that they're safe during an investigation to reduce any of those risks that we're seeing. Now, this isn't just something that we've identified in North Yorkshire Police. As I explained, it's a national matter. And so there's been two very clear documents and reports that are being published by the HMIC, Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabularies, and also Her Majesty's Inspectorates of the Crown Prosecution Service. And the first one was written in 2016, 2017, which is entitled Living in Fear. And more recently, last year, there was the HMIC produced a report which had been commissioned by another forces police and crime commissioner, and that resulted in a number of recommendations coming out of that thematic inspection. North Yorkshire Police have looked at that report, looked at all those recommendations, and we were able to see where we were in relation to that, balanced against those recommendations, and we adopted 4 of those, and we're still working on 2 further incidents, two further recommendations to improve where we are. So a lot of people might ask that question: what is stalking? What is harassment? What is the difference? Well, stalking can be described in a very simple way, as it's an unwanted contact from a person to another person, and that contact is causing the victim to feel distressed or fear. And this differs from harassment in as much that the perpetrators, the offenders of stalking, have an obsession and a fixation on an individual, and that's why the elements of risk include. So across policing, we've tried to introduce a mnemonic, a way to remember what stalking is for police officers is to keep it simple, so that when we go to incidents, we can see that straight away. And the mnemonic that we have as 4 is that it's fixated, it's obsessive, it's unwanted, and it's repeated. And that is where we go in relation to that. So with all offences, there's 2 elements to it. There's the actual act, and there's also the intention element to it. So with stalking, it's the conduct element to it is this course of conduct, more than one occasion where it continues. And those acts in itself may not necessarily be a criminal act, but put together we form the offence of stalking. And the intent is to actually cause a person to fear, or they complete an act which a reasonable person would fear, or the concerns, or that people are actually reckless and that they should have known what they were doing would have had an impact upon a victim. So that's what stalking is, and that's why stalking is so important in terms of where we are and why we need to make sure that the force has the right response in place to be able to deal with these reports and to keep victims safe. And to put this into context in terms of an example, because I think that actually explains it.
Alan, before you do that, sorry to interrupt. I think just 2 things. First of all, on the screen, you might just want to click on slideshow rather than, I think it's possibly on page view, which means that colleagues in the meeting, but also on the broadcast, are seeing quite small text. And then when we've hopefully fixed that, I think Caroline would like to pose you a question in relation to your opening slide.
Okay,
it's not the presentation screen thing is not the end of the world, Alan. Don't worry too much about it. It is legible, but
I can try to do that. I'm just conscious that if I try to do that, Simon, I lose some of the details that I need just to make sure I get the right information. But
okay.
I'll try to do that for you.
Don't worry too much. Stick with it as it is, because I think the presentations will be published in any event, and it is legible. Are you happy to take Caroline's question?
Oh, now? Definitely, and likewise from anybody else.
Yeah, Caroline.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Alan. Really interesting stats there, Alan, and I just wanted to just pick up on that. So the stats show a clear correlation between the key factors, stalking, violence, mental health issues, for example. And I imagine a lot of officers wouldn't always be aware of that full history when they're attending a specific incident. So sometimes those incidents can be dealt with, managed in isolation. So I'd just be interested to know what measures are in place to ensure those officers get that overall understanding of all the key factors and that case history, so that they can support victims of stalking and any sort of further investigations that potentially follow.
Caroline, hopefully that question will be answered later on when we talk about where we're going. Okay, but you're right, we shouldn't be dealing with incidents in isolation. Because if we do that, we're not seeing the wider picture. And we need to understand the wider picture to be able to understand and identify a course of conduct. So the points that you raised there about what else is going on is not dissimilar to what we've seen previously in those reports and how we respond as a force and officers to reports of coercive and controlling behaviour. Is it a single domestic incident, or is it part of a wider pattern of behaviour by an offender against a victim? And so we have got some training that's taken place in lots of different forms across the force, one of which is the domestic abuse matters training, which we start to go live with in April across the force. And within that training, we'll be looking at, or it will be trained around those courses of conduct for coercive and controlling behaviour. And where that has been delivered, because there's the crossover and a lot of similarity between incidents of harassment and stalking with coercive and controlling behaviour, officers should be able to identify those incidents of stalking even more. So we'd see that uplift in terms of those number of reports that we're getting. And part of that training package that we're delivering is not only to identify it, but also, most importantly, how to investigate it in an appropriate way to support the victim and reduce those risks. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Just thinking of those links there with the stats that you've highlighted. Just wanted to query on that.
Okay. So, just as a short case study, it's in relation to a subject who was a male offender who was convicted of stalking following an investigation completed by North Yorkshire Police, and at a guilty plea, he was sentenced early on this year to 2.5 years in custody. What he did was he subjected his victim, his previous partner, to an 18-month ordeal of stalking. And that resulted in that person having to change how they went about their daily life, where they went, the routes they took, either to go to the shops, go to school, to drop children off, and their normal, what we would take is routine. And they had to change that to try to avoid being contacted, approached by this person. And just during a normal routine car service, it was identified that there were tracking devices that had been fitted on the vehicle so that the perpetrator could understand and know where his victim was. And so when we look at those 4 elements of that we talked about, fixated, obsessive, unwanted and repeated, the extent and the perpetrator has gone to identify where somebody is quite clearly fixated on that person. And I think in respect of a 2.5-year sentence for a guilty plea in relation to that, that's probably starting to recognise some of the serious nature in relation to where stalking is. So, to put that into context in terms of numbers and how that affects the force in terms of demand, this slide shows the levels of harassment that has been reported, which is in red, the levels of malicious communication that has been reported, which are in green, and for stalking offences, those that are in blue. And we can see for the period of time that has been recorded, we've seen those steady increases over a number of years of harassment being reported. But most importantly, as we see in the last 5-6 years, an increase of the number of reports of malicious communication and stalking. And if we look towards we're January 2020 on the graph, we've started to see a significant increase around stalking reports. And the reason for that are there a number of reasons for that in terms of it. So stalking is not a new offence, but our understanding, our investigation and our recording of it hasn't been perfect across policing. And that is why we've had those 2 reports that have been produced by the HIC. So previously within investigations, officers used to use something called a police information notice, or it might have been called an harassment warning, or a warning notice to people that we believed may be harassing other people. And that was introduced initially as a form of best practice to try and evidence a course of conduct, because somebody's been told what they're doing is wrong. If they continue to do it, it meets that intent element to it. But that nationally was seen to be some bad practice. So nationally, through the Police Chiefs Council and the National Working Group for Stalking and Harassment, the decision was made that the use of pins, harassment warnings, would be removed. And that is something that North Yorkshire Police have supported, and in fact is a decision that we took before the national direction came out for it to be moved. And so we've seen, so that has contributed to the increase of the number of reports that we've actually got, because we should be investigating the offences that have been reported and investigating what's before us, as we would do with a burglary or a shop theft. We've also had a number of positive campaigns to raise police officers' awareness, staff's awareness in the force control room, but also the public's awareness around what stalking is and how they should report it to it. And I've got some stats later on, just how effective some of those campaigns have been. And so through those campaigns, improved crime recording, because we're identifying offences better than we had done previously through education and training, we are seeing an increase in relation to those stalking statistics being within across North Yorkshire Police. And importantly, we're also seeing a reduction in the harassment. And the reason why I say importantly is stalking, in terms of its severity, is more serious than the harassment. And I think one of the challenges that we'd had before is that we had stalking being seen as harassment, which is in fact, it was the other way around. So where we've seen that increase of stalking recording is positive, and there's a correlation that in terms of the harassment is coming down. So I think we're getting to the right stage where the knowledge and understanding of stalking harassment is right, and the crime recording is reflective of that, if that makes sense. So that's where we are now. But we also need to look at where we're going to go in the future in terms of demand. And so the next slide looks at where we'd anticipate the demand to go. Prediction through our force data modelers, and we can see that we'll continue to have an increase of recording of stalking, and I think that is our prediction in relation to that. And the reasons why we would predict that is A, the training and the education that we're putting in place for our police officers, our continued commitment and support to victims, and our publicising that to groups, through domestic abuse groups and through to victims, and we'll see an increase in report. And the introduction of the stalking team will also contribute towards that, and I'll be able to explain what that team does. So I'm expecting, certainly over the next 2 to 5 years, that increase of demand in relation to stalking. And that isn't just North Yorkshire Police. I think that's probably reflective in a number of other forces as well. So we wouldn't be an outlier in relation to that. I'll just get to the next slide. So that is where we are and where we expect to be. Just wanted to cover some of the initiatives that we've had in the force in relation to our response to stalking. So in May last year, there was a pilot held over at Scarborough Idale on the coast in relation to stalking, and it was a pilot. The purpose of the pilot was to look at how the force and the local policing at Scarborough could respond to those high risk perpetrators and make sure that we were dealing with them in a robust manner, and also to ensure that victims get the right level of support. And because of the nature of stalking and the fact that it's not just a policing response, we need to work with partner agencies to make sure that we can deal with the perpetrator correctly, and also to make sure that the victims are kept safe. So the project, or the pilot that was at place over at the coast, worked with some of our key partners there around Scarborough Borough Council. We worked with IDAS, our Commission Service for Domestic Abuse. Also worked with probation, children and family services within the North Yorkshire social care. And also some of the housing providers as well, which are really important to make sure that the housing provision for victims is safe, that the premises are secure, and if people need additional lighting or security, that they can be put into place as well. And the pilot also allowed for us to have that joint working to prevent any duplication of effort in relation to some of those wraparound services. So in many respects, the way that looked wasn't dissimilar to what we would see as almost a MARAC style meeting for stalking incidents, as we'd see in domestic abuse, and that has had some successes with that, and we've taken some learning from that pilot across the force in relation to that. I'll just get ready for the next slide. Okay, so one of the areas that I wanted to raise was around the challenges that we have in relation to stalking, and I've probably touched on it a couple of times already, which is around the early identification of stalking offences, because when police officers go to a report, they're not necessarily always identifying that a stalking incident has taken place, and I wouldn't expect a victim to always turn around and say, I'm a victim of stalking, because they might not know. because of the motivation of a perpetrator or what is happening. So that's why police officers need to be trained and have the skills to understand what stalking is and identify that at the early stage, because the earlier that we can identify it, the better it is in terms of supporting a victim, putting safeguarding measures in place to protect them so that they don't come to any harm in the future. Also to secure and preserve evidence and identify an offender. And the quicker we identify it, the quicker we are able to do those other parts and bring this to the right resolution in relation to the investigation that we have. We've also got a challenge in relation to digital evidence. A lot of stalking cases, a lot of harassment cases, it's quite commonplace now for digital devices to be used. And the example that I gave before talks about a tracking device. But the recovery of those items and the forensic examination in support of an investigation can extend the length of time that the investigation takes place. And we also need to look at what else is on that device. So if we take a victim's phone, for example, and we need to examine that because they've been sent text messages or we think there's been some spyware put on there by the perpetrator, we need to examine that to record the evidence. But equally, an issue that is raised nationally in a lot of groups is around what is the intrusion by investigations into a victim's private life and where the boundaries that are set with that. So there are some very clear guidelines that we need to follow in terms of investigation of those devices, and what we look at. It's very prescriptive in terms of the investigative needs for that, and not just look at everything on a phone. And that's so that we can manage any investigation in a proportionate, balanced, justified measure to make sure that we don't go beyond where we need to do that. And that's where we go. Of course, with digital devices being found in lots of different investigations, whether or not that's organised crime, drug supply, domestic abuse, the demand to deal and examine those items of equipment is ever growing. Likewise with indecent images of children and investigations from our online team. So that can draw out the length of time that it takes for an investigation to go through, and then the volume of data that we need to review. We also, as a challenge, is around where we are in terms of legislation. So we've seen previously a change of bail and how the police use bail, which is right and appropriate in the way that we do that. And that's to stop those occasions where people have been arrested previously, been left on bail for an extended period of time. And so those changes to legislation is entirely appropriate. But we also need to understand whether or not we need to voluntarily attend a suspect for interview, or do we need to arrest them so that we can utilise some of our other powers, such as search for devices, search for evidence in relation to the stalking that we have. So we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with, what is the evidence, what we're looking for, where we can get it from, and which powers and procedures do we have within policing to be able to deal with the suspect to secure the evidence. And then that leads on to the element of what to do when we've finished interviewing the suspect, and whether or not we need to use police bail to put some safeguarding measures such as conditional bail in place whilst we continue the investigation and potentially be going to court, or do we release them without those conditions? And what is the impact upon that with an investigation for later on, and whether or not does it safeguard a victim? Does it undermine future applications at court, potentially around restraining orders that would be in a court's power to order on conviction? And it's how we use the collective considerations around bail management powers and suspect management to make sure that we get the result. And those are investigative challenges, because understanding the threat and risk that the investigations present is what officers need to do within their investigations to be able to make sure that victims are kept safe in relation to that. So I've explained that this isn't just a response for the police. One of our key partners in relation to stalking and harassment is the Crown Prosecution Service. So the Crown Prosecution Service, it's an independent body to the police, but it's the Crown Prosecution Service who decide whether or not the majority of cases, investigations, will be charged, and whether it goes to court, because they prosecute on behalf of the Crown. It's not and it's our responsibility to provide evidence to them. Recognising that they're a key partner, there has been a joint protocol that's been developed back in 2018, which reflects the government's strategy around violence against women and girls. This protocol sets a set of standards that police officers and police forces need to follow, but likewise there are standards and requirements that the Crown Prosecution Service must follow as in our joint collaborative approach to dealing with incidents of harassment and stalking. By having that effective liaison and joint working with the CPS, we are more likely to have successful outcomes in terms of investigations and prosecutions. And it's very clear within the protocol that investigations should be looking at, is it a stalking case first, yes or no, and then look at whether or not it's harassment. And those sorts of drivers also impact around where we're seeing the change in our crime recording. Because I think previously people were looking at, is it harassment? Yes, and not moving to the next step of stalking. So actually within all the guidance, it is very much around, let's consider is it stalking first, which is the greatest threat and risk towards a victim. If it's not, what is the reason why? And then we'll look at harassment around that. Okay, so that is a policy that we've got in place. It's a protocol that we're following, and that's something that we're working to make sure that we follow as we continue in terms of our training and being raised with officers and investigators across the force in relation to that. And it also forms part of the training that we're being given to police officers and police staff in how to investigate the offences that we have. In terms of making sure that victims are safe, I've talked about the use of bail. There's the safety plans that we'd put in, but there's some new legislation that was introduced early part of last year, which related to stalking prevention orders. Just to touch on these, it's a civil order that the police can proactively apply for, separate to a criminal investigation. And by seeking a stalking prevention order, a breach of that order is punishable up to 5 years in custody. And that will be separate to any other offences that might be committed by the perpetrator for breaking the order. These new stalking prevention orders are different to a lot of the other orders. A lot of other orders that we've been able to obtain through the courts are very much prohibitive in the nature, i.e. you must not contact, you must not go to this place. But the stalking prevention orders now allow the police to seek positive requirements for the person who's subject of that order to comply with. So examples around that would be notification of new relationships, agreeing to attend to a mental health assessment with a recognised mental health provider, or submitting your electrical devices for examination by one of our digital experts, so that we can continue to support an offender, reduce the risk towards the public as well in relation to that. So very much around those positive requirements that we wouldn't be able to obtain through police bail or restraining orders in relation to that. So the two phases in terms of the protection orders. One is an interim, which is on the balance of probabilities whilst we progress during the investigation, and then latterly the full order, which is to a criminal standard, which is unusual for civil orders, but it's this criminal standard beyond reasonable doubt that the stalking has taken place, or we can do that. So at this moment, we've got one order, interim order in place across North Yorkshire, which has been managed well, and we've considered through the formal process of consideration 6 other stalking prevention orders as well. These are not the same in terms of volume of domestic violence orders, and so in terms of the size of the force, the incidents that we have reported and the numbers that we've got, that is probably reflective where we are. And some good news that we received in relation to that is that the force can be reimbursed in relation to our legal fees around that as a result of a Home Office initiative as well. So again, some positive news. So the cost of those orders isn't prohibitive. It's just to encourage forces to be able to use those as we move forward. So last year we saw an uplift through the precept and the support of the Police and Crime Commissioner in relation to stalking, because it was recognised the concerns that we've got, the force's response, and through that we've been able to create a stalking intervention team. The stalking intervention team consists of a detective constable, an investigator who is experienced in stalking investigations, both traditional in terms of stalking, but also the cyber world of stalking, which is ever growing, as I've touched on. He is working with two stalking victims officers. One of them is from a domestic abuse background and has been very successful in developing some training around domestic abuse in force. And they're both in place to be able to support the victims, because the victims do need that additional support. And we're in the process of identifying through our With Foundation, one of our partners, in terms of a specialist stalking perpetrator worker who will be working with the foundation alongside this team. So what will that team be doing on a day-to-day basis, and what have we asked for them to do? Well, we've asked them to review the daily incidents of stalking, incidents of harassment, malicious communications, and to review what's taking place within those to ensure that we're maximising investigative opportunities, ensuring that victims are being kept safe and they are being supported. And they're also there to provide those other police officers, investigators, support around improving investigations, being that tactical advice and support, and sharing some of the best practice that we have across the force and what we've seen either locally, across the region and nationally. And that will then work towards reducing the risk that a perpetrator presents and importantly improving victim care. What they're also doing is completing a structured training. So that's going out to the new student officer intakes that we see that are coming through to deliver a day's training around stalking and harassment, which is really important so that our student officers, as soon as they come out of training, understand what they're dealing with and the risks and the threat that stalking presents. But they will also be going out to investigation hubs and the police stations across the force to deliver training to our existing officers who will already be out there and responding to those incidents to increase their knowledge and understanding around harassment, around stalking and malicious communications and how we should respond to them. And one of the things that we've introduced, and this links to question number one at the very start of the meeting today, they're introducing a stalking clinic. So the purpose of the stalking clinic, because we're in the COVID times, will be by MS Teams, our meeting network inside, so we can do it virtually. But it's the opportunity for police officers and investigators to be able to book a 2-hour appointment with members of the stalking intervention team so that they can review the nature and the incident that has been reported, the circumstances of those, and so that the stalking team can then provide that specialist advice to the investigation team about what's happening, and also for them to consider additional lines of inquiry that might have been not been covered before, and also support to victims that may not have been covered, whether or not that's through some of the national stalking charities. That would result in an investigative plan being given to the officer that's investigating it. And what we're looking for is not only just that the officer who's investigating it comes to it, but also their supervisor, because that supervisor may well be supporting other staff who've got similar investigations. And it's about raising everybody's awareness and understanding about this area of investigation of stalking and harassment over the way around.
So, Alan, I think thanks for touching on the public question as well, because I think perhaps the questioner understood that to be a sort of publicly accessible clinic. But I know you're going to go on, perhaps together with Jenny, to say something about support for victims and also overall awareness raising and how to assist victims and potential victims to work out what that scenario means for them in terms of stalking and harassment. Just while I've taken the liberty of interrupting, I know Caroline does have a question just arising from, I think, the slide around the stalking intervention team. So Caroline?
Thanks, Simon. Sorry, Alan, me again. Just with all this great work that's being implemented now, and the support and the team that's now in place, and just thinking about the feedback from the pilots as well, is there plans in place to work with victims to receive sort of that feedback to help enhance the service further?
There is. We've spoken with victims before in relation to domestic abuse, and the victim experience is really important to me. Not what's been good, probably what's been bad, and how can we improve that, because we need to understand what is working, what's not working, and we can listen internally from police officers and investigators in terms of that. But actually, we're here to protect the public, and the public's voice is really important in terms of that feedback. So yes, we're very keen to listen to the experiences and the problems that victims have experienced. And I know from the work that you and I have done, we do get some of that comes through your office, and I welcome that, because without getting that, we don't always get the feedback. Yeah. And so one of the things that we have done is we have worked with victims before to come into our training, and we need to strike that right balance, but that we don't re-traumatize a victim. Yeah. And that's why previously we have recorded them on video, and we've used that. And that's certainly going to form part of where we are for the domestic abuse training as well for that. So very keen to make sure that we do capture and listen to the voice of victims so that we can understand and improve. And actually by doing that, it has had some positive outcomes. And I can think of several cases where that has taken place without going into those details. So very much, I totally agree, we do need that information.
Yeah, and it's almost an offering as well, because of the feedback that we have as well, that we can help enhance those services further with the feedback that we have from the office as well.
Yes, because we probably come from a policing perspective, but we need to understand what does a victim experience, and what we think is right might not always be right, and we've got to be open and receptive to listening to that and the reasons why, and also what are the barriers for people reporting, because unless we're told or we get to those reports, we won't be able to respond. And I think people should be able to identify themselves. Oh, that doesn't sound right. Let's call the police, no matter how small it is, because then we can have a look at it. And if we've got police officers that are trained, they're professionally curious, and they understand what stalking is because of what we're doing and the work that we're doing, we should get that right response to be able to support a victim through that.
And absolutely, that curiosity, back to my first question about understanding some of those kind of key factors that you'd look for, so you know where to pursue a little bit more.
And this around safeguarding across the board is asking that question, why? Yeah. You know, why is that child going missing, running away? Is it because of something in the house, or is it something pulling them from the house? The push and pull factors, or why is that? Why is that being reported? And if we understand the why, we ask that question why, we then start to get that professional curiosity to understand it, and that was where we need to get to.
Thank you.
Okay. So that probably links nicely, Caroline, into the next slide in relation to skills and knowledge and the inputs. So my personal view around stalking and harassment is that important that prior to the stalking team coming into place, I would deliver that input to the student officers, because I think the student officers need to understand this is the level of seriousness that we're talking about, because of the impact that it can have on a victim and the tragic outcomes that we've seen nationally in relation to stalking incidents. And so that is now being delivered by our stalking team for those student officers. I've touched on the domestic abuse matters training from the original question, I think, that you'd raised, Caroline, in terms of the training. We are looking to deliver training around the domestic abuse matters to 75% of the frontline staff in the first phase of the training. And then the second phase, obviously, will increase that beyond 75%. But because that will be looking at courses of conduct and the correlation between coercive and controlling behaviour, stalking and harassment and that nature of offence, I expect that we will see an increase in reporting and an identification of that by police officers. And that's not just based on the conversations that we've had around the providers. That's also been seen in some of the other forces where they've had similar training, which is positive because that means officers are going with that professional curiosity. They're dealing with not just what's in front of them, the wider picture about what's going on within that relationship or with that victim to be able to support them. We've touched on the stalking clinics because it's not just about dealing with what's in front of them to give them advice around that investigation. It's also about giving those officers that are seeking the advice at the clinic the skills, the tools to be able to deal with further investigations as they go forward within their careers and investigation. In the last 3-4 months, we've introduced mini masterclasses across the force. These are a 20-minute, 30-minute session that are broadcasted across the force that people can link into, where there's a subject matter expert who provides advice at an operational level around areas of policing. So we've had them around domestic abuse, we've had them in relation to stalking and harassment as well. And that has been really positive in relation to the take-up. And it's not just a one session that takes place. We actually record it and we're building a library so police officers who are either not on duty or have not been able to see it at the time can go to it, review it and listen to it. And that's to give those police officers that practical advice to support victims, how to investigate and what they should and equally what they shouldn't be doing in relation to that. That advice and the skills that we're talking about have also been about raising police officers' awareness about the joint protocol, about the standards that they need to be working to in the submission of files and the evidence to the CPS so that we can be more successful in the number of charge decisions that we're seeking. And it's also around sharing the information and the really good products that have been developed by the College of Policing. And they've developed 3 really key, useful documents for officers and police staff and investigators. And the first is around call takers. What's happening in the force control room when those calls are coming in? What advice are we giving to victims when they're reporting those concerns? And a very operational based advice document. Likewise, there's a similar document for police officers who are responding to those incidents about what they should do, what they shouldn't do around supporting victims and lines of inquiries in relation to that. And equally, there's another document for supervisors. So those 3 documents are being promoted internally in a number of different forms and venues to make sure that we are following what has been identified as the national best practice around some of those investigation standards for stalking offences. And that's why when we've seen those and when released, we've seen some of those jumps in the graph around recording as well. But it's not just around passing the information out to our teams. We've also got some dip sampling, some auditing to make sure what we think is happening is actually taking place so that myself as the lead for stalking has got that assurance of is what's happening in the force actually happening is the way I expect it to. And that is something that is monitored and raised through the force's operational board meeting, which is chaired by ACC Anderson. And in terms of our specialist officers in that small but dedicated stalking unit, they attended specialist conferences such as the Alice Ruggles Trust so that they can develop their understanding, their awareness, what the national pictures are, national best practice, to make sure we capture that and we bring that back into force to make sure our staff have got the skills to make sure that we can move forward in support of victims.
Allan, what feedback have you had for the clinics and for the masterclasses? And second question, what kinds of issues do you think still need to be focused on going forward to to get us to get us into even sort of better practice around this?
We had some good uptake in relation to attendance. If memory serves right, I think we had between 35 and 40 staff at that. Now, that might not seem a lot of people when you consider the size of North Yorkshire Police. But when we think about the number of officers that would be on duty at a particular time, the time of the day when we put that on, compared with some of the other master classes, I think that's been quite a good uptake in relation to it. Okay, and of course we've got the library with that. So the uptake has been good. Some really positive feedback and comments of people's awareness that they didn't know. So, for example, we might say to a victim, if they're being bombarded by emails, social media posts, delete your account or block that person. And then that sounds to be a practical, common sense solution. But actually, by doing that, it can increase the risk. So it's about myth busting as well within that, to be able to give officers and staff the tools to be able to respond. Now, we talked about previously around we've withdrawn the use of police information notices and harassment warnings. That's the right and proper thing to do. And we should investigate the offence before us. But there is still some views that actually we can give words of advice. Well, again, that's not appropriate. That's something that we're looking at, because we should be investigating it. In the same way we'd investigate a burglary to identify who was responsible, we should investigate stalking and harassment. And it's being evidence-led in our investigation and considering the victim's wishes in relation to that. And that's where we need to go, which is exactly the same around domestic abuse. Evidence. Where does the evidence in this case take us, and where do we need to go in relation to that to manage that risk in relation to it? Does that answer your question, Sam?
Yeah, Alan, it does. Thank you. So I'm just a little bit conscious of time. I don't think we've had any public questions so far. That might give us a little bit of wriggle room on the timing for the agenda. But I know both yourself and Jenny are keen to get some important messages presented around support for victims and awareness raising. So if I could just put a little gentle pressure on you in terms of time,
okay.
But we're in your hands.
Okay, so I touched on around education. It's not internally, we've also done it externally. So I think when you just look at some of those number of hits and the reaches that we've had across social media in terms of across Facebook, etc., they're into the 20,000s. And when we look at that case result that I touched on at the very beginning, that's reached over 83,000 people on Facebook. So this is around raising people's awareness, because no matter how small the incidents that are taking place, it's part of something else. So there's always that continued request to the public, no matter how small or unimportant that other people might see it to be, it's important to us. And if you tell us what it is, we can actually deal with it. And that's the important position for us to go to. And we've got a number of support aid services that we work with to be able to support. And one of the new ones that has been released is the one that's listed at the bottom from the Susie Lamprew Trust, which Am I Being Stalked, which allows people to log on and answer some of those questions themselves to be able to get that answer. And then they can get that additional support. In addition to the other charities that we've got there. And I think what they are on the slides, and what I would ask is if anybody's got any concerns, that they use those support services if they don't feel confident to come to North Yorkshire Police. But if what I would say is, no matter how small it is, do come to us, because we can answer those questions and we can provide you with that support in relation to where we are. Simon, that comes to the end of my presentation, and I'll be ready to hand over to Jenny if she's ready. Unless there's any other questions.
Alan, thank you. There was nothing else particularly from me, but I do know in terms of the last slide, which does contain a lot of information, I know that Simon Jones is working very hard in the background to ensure that the information is promoted through our social media channels during the course of the broadcast, and obviously it's there for follow-up as well, so that information is as widely available as possible. It's very important that it should be so. Can I hand over to you, Jenny?
Good afternoon. I'm Jenny Newbury. I'm Head of Commissioning and Partnerships for the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner. The Commissioner has devolved responsibilities for supporting victims of crime to cope and recover, stalking victims being one of those groups of individuals. The slides that I'm going to present today, which I will try to do quickly, knowing that we've got limited time, are in relation to sharing information with the public about how victims can access those support services and if they do access those support services, what they can expect to receive from them. So if I can ask Alan to move on to the next slide. Unfortunately, we've got an old pack being presented. I'm wondering if Alan could just pull that presentation, and I'll see if I can put up the pack of slide that needs to go onto the screen. If you give me 1 second, I'll see if I can make sure that I can present the right one. I don't think that's presenting, is it, Simon?
Yes, it is. But it's in a window.
See it.
Yeah, it's in a window, but I think it's perfectly legible if you're happy with that. I don't think there's any further information from your desktop that's visible. It's just not showing as a slideshow.
Okay, so I'll take us through this. So in terms of the supporting victims team, that's the team that provides victims of crime practical and emotional telephone support and referral into specialist services. So victims of stalking have an enhanced entitlement to support to cope and recover under the Code of Practice for Victims of Crime. And what that means is that they have a priority in terms of contact from us and access to specialist support services. So victims would be referred to the supporting victims team automatically by North Yorkshire Police once they confirm that a stalking crime has taken place. So you would be automatically contacted as a victim of stalking by the supporting victims team. They receive referrals for non-domestic abuse stalking crimes only, as domestic abuse stalking crime victims would be referred by the North Yorkshire Police domestic abuse coordinators and officers, and they're a team that sit within Alan's safeguarding function. Stalking victims can also self-refer into the supporting victims team, and I think this is a really important message that we want to get across to the public. You do not have to report a crime to North Yorkshire Police to be provided with support to cope and recover. You can access that support as a self-referral or by a partner agency referral, and that can be done into the supporting victims team by telephone or by contact via an online form. And there's a link in the presentation that's been provided to the public for that form. So again, just to reiterate, from a victim's perspective, whether stalking or any other crime, you do not need to report to NYP to receive support. Anyone who considers themselves to be a victim of crime can self-refer into supporting victims team for support at any time. In terms of what happens next, so the supporting victims team will attempt to contact victims of non-domestic abuse stalking by phone to offer immediate emotional and/or practical support. Domestic abuse stalking victims, and that's where stalking is found to be part of a previous intimate relationship or where there is an ex-partner or a wider family member involved, would be contacted, as I've said previously, by the North Yorkshire Police Domestic Abuse Coordinator or officer team. If supporting victims are unable to reach a stalking victim by phone after attempts, then where it's safe to do so, a letter would be sent outlining the support available and how to access it, so that a victim could, as we've said before, opt in to receive support in a self-referral. If stalking victims require in-depth face-to-face support, supporting victims team or the domestic abuse coordinators or officers would refer them into our specialist commissioned services. So that's the domestic abuse service that's provided by IDAS, where stalking is found to be part of a previous intimate relationship or by an ex-partner or a wider family member, or the independent victim advisor service provided by victim support, where stalking is non-domestic. So that takes us into those specialist services and what is provided. So our specialist domestic abuse and independent victim advisor services support victims of stalking to cope with the immediate impact of crime and recover from the harm experienced. They provide a personalised, dedicated, face-to-face support from the point of crime through the criminal justice process and beyond. They assess and they document the level of need across 9 categories, and those 9 categories were developed in partnership with victims by the Ministry of Justice. And victims identify what their needs are on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of the level of need. And that is reassessed at key stages in service delivery and on service exit. And that's about monitoring progress and about making sure that outcomes are realised for victims. The services will also undertake safety need risk assessments using the domestic abuse, stalking and honour-based violence dash risk checklist. And they'll develop a bespoke cope and recovery plan that's based on those assessments in partnership with each victim to address the needs and risks. They'll also then work through each victim's cope and recovery plan in partnership with the individual. And I think Alan mentioned previously, there are a number of organisations that our service providers work with to make sure that their provision is continuously improving. And just 2 of those to mention are kind of Action Against Stalking and the Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service. But obviously there are others that our service providers are working with to make sure that their provision is up to date. That's the end of my slides, so I will pull that presentation now. And hopefully that takes us out of the presentation.
Jenny, yes, it does. Thank you very much. And I know Simon will work hard to ensure that those contact telephone numbers for supporting victims and the other services and the online link are promoted through social media. I know we all know the answer to this, but just for the sake of clarity for people listening in, do those services cost anything?
They don't. Absolutely, they are free and available if you are a historic victim of crime or you are a recent victim of crime as well. So for any crime type, and as to whether the crime that's taken place was historic, happened in the past, or whether it's something that's happened recently.
Jenny, thank you very much for that. There's nobody signalling in the virtual room any particular questions. And so with that in mind, just in the interests of brevity, I'll move straight on, if that's all right, to Mark and your presentation on overall North Yorkshire Police performance.
Okay, thank you. Please keep me right on time. I'll share a presentation, and Simon, if you can let me know when this has been shared, that would be appreciated.
Yes, so it's on screen now and it's now in full screen. So I think you're in business.
Excellent, great. Okay, hello everyone. Mark Pannoni, I'm the Assistant Chief Constable here in North Yorkshire Police. I'm going to go through January's performance data for North Yorkshire Police. And I think in fairness, if anyone has got a question, please just shout it out as I'm going through. Bearing in mind time, it might be the easiest way that I can respond quickly. So I'm going to go through using the 4 key organisational themes of caring about the vulnerable, ambitious collaboration, reinforcing local policing and enhancing our customer experience. And going straight into one of the key challenges for us with regards to caring for the vulnerable, looking at mental health for this period. When we're looking at mental health policing, between 20 and 25% of all incidents actually have a mental health aspect to it. It's obviously an area of quite significant sensitivity for us to make sure that we get it right and we deal with an individual appropriately and sensitively. Mental health demand has gone down, as has all most demand in the last few months. But we are dealing with a significant number of incidents still where there is a mental health aspect to it. We've broken down the key areas where there is a mental health issue or an aspect to the policing, and obviously concern for safety where people have been reported missing or where someone is not acting appropriately and people need help. Typically the police are the first port of call, and we are there to support people as best that we can. We have a technical solution to really provide us with an accurate amount of data to determine whether we are dealing with someone with a mental health issue, and we have wider support from partners around the county and further afield to make sure that we get it right. It's interesting though this month, if you look at our detentions where we actually detained someone under the Mental Health Act, which is a power that the police have got, and this month in January we actually did detain someone and bring them into a custody environment, which is very exceptional for us. And it's even more exceptional. It was a person who was a juvenile. It was someone under 18. This is only done when absolutely necessary, when there is no other option available, as was the case here, and a full review then followed on with this case. And it's recognised by all professionals from the mental health world, from social services and from the police, that regrettably this was the only way we could deal with this individual, who thankfully now is getting the care, the support that he needs. But a serious case that generated a lot of questions about how we all work in partnership when dealing with mental health issues. When we look at when we use our powers for mental health policing outside of the custody environment, our numbers have gone down this month. The public question that was asked at the start of the session asked, is this because of lockdown? Is this because of COVID? And I think the answer is probably almost inevitably yes, because we are not getting to see the incidents on the streets necessarily that we would see otherwise. So like a lot of our calls for service, we are seeing a reduction because of lockdown. Whether that will then resurface in a different way because there is a hidden harm there which is developing, who knows, but we're certainly prepared for that. But just for the final point on mental health policing, on average, over 7 officers are required for every mental health incident we deal with, compared to 2.5 officers for all other incidents. And typically per incident, it is taking us 19 hours when you accumulate all the officer time, compared to 2.5 hours, just under 2.5 hours for every other type of incident. So 19 hours compared to 2.5 hours, you can see it's a significant amount of North Yorkshire Police's time invested to make sure that we get it right for people who are suffering from mental health issues. But as the member of the public mentioned, yes, we are seeing a reduction at the moment in 136 calls for service, and I suspect it is highly likely that that is related to the current COVID situation. If we look at crimes and incidents more generally, the graph on the right there are storm incidents. Storm's our computer system. We have a spike in the weekends, and that's absolutely normal for those calls for service. And what we're seeing, typically our afternoons are most busy for us, but we've had about 6,000 incidents and 2,500 crimes this month. If we go to the 3 separate commands, the key neighbourhood commands that police the county, in the city, which covers York and Selby, we have seen a reduction of about 10.7% compared to January of last year, which is a significant reduction. For the coastal command, which is Scarborough and Rydale, we've seen a reduction of 3.22%. There's slightly less numbers of incidents and crimes there, and less than the city or the county command, but we've seen that reduction there. And then in the county, we have also seen a reduction. That's a reduction of 12.4% of crimes and incidents. So that's across Hambleton, Richmond, Harrogate and Craven. And you'll see here and in the previous slides the crime volume in each of the wards in each of those 3 commands. I'd like, however, to spend a little bit more time looking at a bit more detail. And what we'll see, and this is without doubt a lockdown, a COVID effect, we have seen crime reduced across the whole suite of crime types, with a couple of exceptions. So confronting those exceptions, looking at where we've seen increases in drug offences, we've seen increases in possession of weapons offences, and we've seen increases in public order. And I'll just go through those one at a time. The drug offences, that is almost wholly cannabis-related offences, both production, supply, and possession. The rationale for that, the reason for that, quite simply, is because we have been proactive. We've been following our methodology of prevention and early intervention. We have been stop checking a lot of people, and invariably we have been finding more drugs. So it is a self-generated aspect for the police, through the fact that we have been working, focusing on individuals who we feel the need to stop on the streets, and that's why the drug offences have increased. The possession of weapons offences is an interesting one. That's probably a recording issue, because of some legislation changes actually around the customs excise legislation around importation, and this is postal, people sending themselves stuff through the post, which we never actually recorded in the past. So I'm not too concerned about that from a is North Yorkshire getting more violent or more dangerous? No, it's not. It's how we are now recording those. And with regards to the public order offences, this is a national trend. It doesn't necessarily include the COVID tickets here, which I will talk about in a minute. But there's been lots of challenges for people during lockdown, and I think it demonstrates itself through people venting in the street and us being there to respond to that, which is why we've seen that increase of about 6% in public order over the month. Very, very quickly, a couple of little trends that we've seen as well, which are concerning. They're not visible there, but when you look at the violence against the person stuff, the assault against a constable has gone up 27% where officers have been assaulted, and the assaults against constables where they haven't been assaulted, it's actually gone up 50%. So we are seeing quite a bit of violence against emergency service workers. We're seeing that against ambulance staff as well, and that's something that's really important that we focus on and prosecute where it's appropriate. And then linked to the presentation from Allan before, but engaging in coercive behaviour has actually gone up 58% in the month to 286 offences, which is something of concern. But it could also be argued to be a positive because it means that we're proactively dealing with it. So breaking down into the districts, in reality, a reduction across the suite because of lockdown, with the exception of drug offences. I'm going to skip over domestic abuse because I know there's been conversations about domestic abuse in this arena recently, and just go on to antisocial behaviour, public safety, welfare and casualty from road traffic collisions. Antisocial behaviour, including our COVID tickets, has gone up significantly. That is because we are giving out tickets to people who are breaching the lockdown rules, which is obviously a role for the police. We do this appropriately, sensitively, and we do it proportionately, following the 4E methodology, with enforcement being the last resort. But we have felt the need to provide COVID tickets to people where appropriate. But that obviously means that our antisocial behaviour, because that's what COVID tickets come under, our ASB data looks in the way that it does. And that's increased across the piece, but that would be absolutely expected. And that is consistent with national trends. The KSI, killed or seriously injured data there, I just want to put a caveat on it, in as much as that is all traffic data and not just that of people who've been killed or seriously injured. What we are seeing actually is a reduction in our number of collisions, but a consistent number of people dying on our roads. What that tells me is that we need to focus on that more serious end of incidents, because we are having the same number of people dying, even though those numbers are coming down. And that's something that's really, really important to look at, and is an area of real interest for the developing County Road Safety Partnership, which is moving on from the current 95 Alive approach.
Mark, would you mind just taking a question from me on the COVID ticket side of things? It'll obviously be, it's a topical subject given the last 24 hours or so of announcements. No doubt the public that are watching this broadcast will be interested to know whether there will be any change in the way in which North Yorkshire Police responds and deals with the challenge of COVID and the enforcement regime in the light of what's to come over the next 50 days or so that the Prime Minister outlined. And I just wondered whether you've got any key messages you want to give out about that.
Key messages are that, first of all, we are going to look at what the legislation says and make sure that we're really clear about the legislation. We will then look to see what the communities in North Yorkshire and the City of York want us to do, and actually what the national mood is with regards to enforcement, and whether that is going to continue in the same way or whether there are differences of approaches. We will be taking guidance from the National Police Chiefs Council and from the Home Office, but the most important thing, first of all, is to understand what the new legislation is, what we're allowed to do, what we're not allowed to do. And with our local resilience forum partners, we will make sure that we are absolutely clear of what's going to be expected within the county. We've had the headlines, but as always with this COVID-related issue, the devil is in the detail, and we want to get the detail right. But the key thing still at the moment is that this is a public health emergency, and we need to be supporting each other to keep each other safe.
Thanks, Mark.
Okay, so moving on, and again, very mindful of time, there's going to be a lot of developments within our world of proactivity around our roads policing group, our operational support unit and our firearms support unit within the next couple of months, which we will provide updates to you on. But we really are looking at how best to get benefit out of these specialist departments, which I lead. But just very briefly, we've had some fantastic results over the last month with some really quite high-end criminals coming into this county who've been intercepted, detained, arrested and subsequently prosecuted for offences which were going to be committed in this county. And I'm really quite proud of those. Unfortunately, time doesn't allow me to go into some detail, but we have stopped some county line stuff happening that really would have been causing huge problems. We've managed to stop some vehicles where a lot of drugs have been picked up. And also where there's antisocial behaviour, I've used specialist resources to really try and get to the bottom of that specialist, those antisocial behaviour issues, which are ongoing in some parts of the county. The data there, the information there from the Royal Task Force is available for you to see about how we're developing our Royal Task Force, and that will again continue to develop as we're going in the next couple of months. And with regards to our contact with the public, I think it's fair to say that we had a significant challenge in early January where 37 of our members of staff who take calls from the public all went off for COVID-related issues. We would typically have up to about 15 people dealing with a certain part of call handling. At one point, we only had 2 people from their shift able to come in, which meant that we had to bring people in from all over the county to really to shore up our call handling capability. So the data which shows that we had a slower average speed of answer and a longer average call duration is very understandable from the perspective of the fact that we had a large number of our call handlers and call takers off sick or off shielding or doing what was appropriate for them. So actually, I'm really quite proud of the fact they managed to do what they did at the time when, in fact, so many of them were off on unable to support North Yorkshire. We do, however, have mechanisms when this sort of thing happens. We have buddy systems with other forces where basically we pass over our calls to other forces. And in fact, we've been supporting other forces today. And that works really well. So members of the public are never at risk from this situation occurring. So some data there on that's relevant for police and crime plan. Just some highlights there that show some differences, but I don't think there's anything there that I haven't covered already, with the exception of in Selby and York and Harrogate. You'll notice that cybercrime is there. That is because of a new way that we are recording fraud offences. And so that articulates why we've seen an increase in what we define as cyber. But again, this is a recording mechanism of how we are now recording fraud, which was previously with action fraud and is now being held by us as well. So I'd like in the last couple of minutes we've got just to go into the people aspect and just looking at police officers and PCSOs. And again, I know that there's some public questions here. So very, very quickly, we are on track with our recruitment and our long-term target for officers. Obviously, the uplift has been really useful for us, and this is very much work in progress going through phase 1 to phase 2 and phase 3. And I wonder if Chief Constable, you'd like to come in on the officer uplift.
Yes, certainly. And I don't know if we're able to put there's two people related questions in this respect from the public. I don't know if we can put them up on the screen, but if I remember them correctly without them being on the screen, one of those questions was about whether we'd uplifted in PCSO numbers. So in a previous precept round, we did indeed increase the number of PCSOs by 23.5 posts above what was 200 originally to 223.5 in a previous precept round. So we have looked at the shape of the organisation. We absolutely value and understand the benefit of the work that our PCSOs do out in our communities, and the particular business case was put before the Police and Crime Panel to increase the number of PCSOs so that we could enhance that service out in our communities. So we have previously increased PCSO numbers. However, the current police officer uplift that you have seen nationally is a government initiative. So that isn't something that's been supported by precept uplift locally. That is something that is a government initiative over 3 years to uplift police officers nationally by 20,000. And in the two previous rounds, we saw an uplift of 58 for North Yorkshire Police to the end of this financial year. So that's 2021. And we have had notification of an additional 55 officer uplift for the next financial year, so 21-22. And then towards the end of this next financial year, we will be given the uplift numbers for North Yorkshire Police in the final tranche of that police officer uplift. So previous precept, we've seen uplift in PCSOs and police officers locally. The current uplift is police officers only, and that is a national initiative. Just of interest, looking at the history of the force, we now have more PCSOs than we originally had. Obviously, we've seen that uplift against the core numbers. We were originally at 183, so that's a good increase. And we've also now had a significant increase in police officers as a result of local precept and the national uplift, I think nearly to the previous highest levels of police officers North Yorkshire Police has ever seen. I think the other people-related question was about how are we deciding where to put those officers. So in that respect, we hold a detailed suite of information in North Yorkshire Police and nationally about what are the current crime and demand trends, what are the crime and demand, and not just crime, on all demand on policing coming towards us in the future. So the predicted demand of things like the increase in cyber, we've seen an increase in online child abuse, and what sort of specialist skills do we need our officers and staff to have going forward in the future? Based on our knowledge of where that demand is going to come from and the desire to prevent harm and not just to react to it, to be more proactive about preventing harm in our communities, we take an intelligence and information-based decision on where to put those additional officers and staff in order to best serve our communities and prevent harm and deliver the best possible service in respect of those demands that we know are coming down the track and the demands that are facing our public at the moment, so we can deliver the most efficient, effective service to keep our public safe, but also make them feel safe. So hopefully that answers the two questions that were posed.
Thank you, Lisa. Yes, I'm sure it does. No doubt we'll have the opportunity for feedback. We haven't had any during the meeting, but we'll have the opportunity for feedback afterwards if there are any follow-up points from those questioners or indeed from anybody else watching. Mark, I think that takes us back to you just to conclude your presentation in the last few moments of the meeting, doesn't it?
Yeah, okay, thank you, and I appreciate it's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Just one thing though on the workforce diversity, which I think we are really proud of. We know that our BAME representation now in the force is greater than the force area population, and that's been recognised nationally. And likewise, our joiner rate continues to increase with regards to BAME community members. Both are, which are really quite positive indicators for us that our engagement is going well. But obviously, there's always room for improvement and always room for creativity and innovation about how we do that. But with regards to any of the information I've provided today, if any other information is needed, please get in contact with me and I can hopefully provide some information and tease out further stuff from the information pack, the presentation that was there.
Mark, thank you. Thank you for that. and I can't see anybody that's indicated questions within the meeting. So grateful for that. Simon will confirm, I'm sure, but I don't think we have had in the last few moments any questions from the public arising from that item or any of the earlier presentations. And I don't have any indications of in advance of any AOB, and I don't think anybody's signalling any within the meeting. So it probably just remains for me to thank everybody for their contributions, the hard work that goes into the presentations, and to thank those that have viewed the broadcast for tuning in. The date of our next meeting is the 23rd of March 2021, when the Commissioner will no doubt resume the chair. I know she will be very sorry not to have been able to join us this afternoon for unavoidable reasons, but I'll close the meeting on that point, and in the time-honoured way during the pandemic, bid everybody to stay safe. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.